know this, but the Joburg Library in the centre of Johannesburg is one of the biggest libraries in the country. It's supposed to house around 1.5 million books, also quite an old building, been operating as a library, the institution, for around 100 years. But the entire building has been closed since at least 2019. In other words, since 29 people haven't been able to use the facility, and the books are sitting there on the shelves unopened. The city says this is because water got into the building in 2019 and the pandemic then stopped work on the building. The campaign's now been launched to force the city to reopen one of its major assets. Griffin Shea is the founder of the organisation Bridge Books. Griffin, good afternoon to you. How important is the Joburg Library? What kind of role did it used to play? I know people who say they grew up there.
It's a hugely important centre for the city because it was one of the spaces where people could gather freely. It was extremely well used, so it was always full of students. It had really cool book clubs running inside, and a lot of non-book kind of treasures that people don't always think about. So there's a music library inside where you could listen to music, get sheet music, have a musical instrument. There's an art gallery, there's a theater. There's every periodical ever published in the city, so if you wanted the Star newspaper from the 1890s, you could find that in the basement. And the Africana collection is actually unique in the world. So it used to be researchers would come from all over looking for books that actually don't exist anywhere else except in the Joburg City Library.
1.5 million books is what the Joburg City website says. Is that right?
That's right. And a lot of them, you look at the building, you think they can't possibly be true, but it's actually because the stacks are underneath library gardens. There's tunnels under the park that hold most of the books. And the books are, they're theoretically available. You could go to one of your neighborhood libraries, and there are 86 branch libraries functioning, varying degrees around the city. And if you did need a book from the city library, someone would go and find it for you. And I do think it's important to think about how important the branch libraries are as well. That's where people in their neighborhoods would go to access resources. But the city library plays a really special role because it contributes to the sense that the city is not functioning. And when you're in the city center, you've got the city library and then the old post office, which is also closed. You've got the park spaces, which are functioning in kind of varying degrees of, openness. And you don't want that. You actually want all that public land to be open and accessible and to really teach people how to use the public spaces, because that's meant to be for everyone, places where anyone can go in. And in Joburg, we don't have a beach, we don't have a mountain, so we need public spaces that we build where people can gather and be together.
We also need places where people can browse, where two people who don't know each other can bump into each other in the, history of Rinderpest section and, come together and suddenly write a paper afterwards because now they've met each other. I mean, that sort of element of browsing together in shared spaces is important.
Right, and I think for, if you're living in the city, and there's 500,000 residents of the city center, people, and oftentimes we think of them, the residents, we assume it's all these kind of like squatter settlements, but it's not. I mean, there's a lot of old offices that are now quite nice apartment buildings, but you're still living in, 30, 40 square meters of space maybe. You need spaces where you can go outside, be in a different space, be in a place where people can gather. And I think to really think about the library as like a tourist attraction, as a cultural institution, it's not just a place where people go and access books, it's a place where like life can happen. And in the course of doing this campaign of trying to convince people, hey, let's talk to our city councilors, let's, see what can happen about this, it's amazing how many people have come in with stories to remember, I used to go there all the time, and not just as a kid, but as an adult, and that's how I got through varsity, was by using that space to study and using the resources that are inside.
What do we know about what's actually happening inside? What is the state of the building?
So I think one of the things that's been really frustrating is the lack of communication, and sometimes different officials are willing to speak off the record about it, even for us as like a nonprofit, not like for some kind of expose. It's just really to figure out, can we support you in getting the building reopened? There's this real reluctance to speak, which is hard to understand, and I think one of the good things about this campaign over the last month is that it has gotten people to open up. And so the city did put out a statement last week where they were explaining, actually, there is all this water work that needs to be done. I mean, water and books aren't friends. They can't be hanging out, so it's good to fix that. And we've seen fire is a real danger, so you don't want fire safety issues either. But if you need, as they're saying, 45 million rand to finish the repair, I understand, I think everyone understands, that money was probably not just lying around to be spent. Like, it has to be budgeted and allocated. But, we live in a city that does have money, and if you went, with an open mind and maybe a different mindset around how you finance things, to think about like the Market Theatre Foundation, which can assist with the operations of the theater. To have that kind of a model where you can access money from the outside, account for it, be audited, spend it independently, but support a public good. To me, there's more than one way to think about that.
I mean, we live in an era where some companies sponsor schools. You know, if you drive past them, you'll see a school that clearly is receiving money from, private sector, and there must be a way to do it. So there's no understanding of why it's taking so long. I mean, and it's not, I mean, it's an old building, but it was refurbished relatively recently, wasn't it?
So the story that I've been told by the JDA and the Joburg Development Agency and the different city officials is that, the work was identified as necessary, and some of the pipes were leaking into the walls. So it wasn't super obvious that there was a problem with water damage at first. Some of it was leaking into ceiling spaces where it also wasn't super obvious at first what needed to happen. And some of it is storm damage, and that's also understandable. I mean, like, our homes get damaged in storms sometimes. We get that. The hail a few weeks ago was horrible. But then when they went in, they actually did do one round of repairs. The building was covered in scaffolding. And when they went in to inspect it, it wasn't up to standard. So they had to redo it to get their public safety certificates, which is now another round of work. So the JDA has been tasked with redoing it. And I think the JDA does great work. Like, that's not the issue. The issue is where you're going to find basically the money to do it a second time.
Do we know if the books are safe where they are? Could many of them be damaged, and that's why people are so scared to tell us about it?
I suppose that's possible, but I guess that's not my main concern, oddly, because I think the water, it does sound like it was in the walls. So there might be an issue around damp, which, again, we have in our homes sometimes, right? It's not that unusual. But no one's told me anything they were worried about the books themselves, and the stacks are accessible. On the other hand, it would just create so much goodwill to have people in the city say that really clearly. Like, and here's pictures of inside so you can see what's happening. And just a regular update would make people feel so much better. The last sign in front of the building is from maybe 2 years ago.
Sure.
Directing people to Mayfair. And it's not that much to ask to say, like, hey, just like, send us an update every now and then.
What kind of service are people getting at other branch libraries in Joburg? I mean, I find it's so patchy. Members of my family were actually at a library last week and found that it was, the opening hours were proudly displayed. It was during the opening hours and the library was closed. And I hear so many stories like that.
Yeah, people have come to me with a lot, and I think there's also a communication issue. So my neighborhood library would be Norwood, which was completely redone. They've built a beautiful community center and new sports ground, community hall, new library. But then because that's not communicated, that it's open, what are the hours, the people are welcome inside. And I think for so many South Africans, people didn't grow up with a neighborhood library necessarily. So you do actually have to teach people, this is a public space, you're welcome here, the books here are free, you can take them home with you. But there have been so many people coming in with stories wishing that the libraries were opening on Saturdays, as they were before COVID. And there were even Sunday hours before COVID, where during at least exam periods, students could go in and study restricted hours and not the entire building, but there was a space for people who need electricity and Wi-Fi and a toilet just to be able to get their studies done effectively. That's such a valuable service. I don't actually understand what the issue is around the staffing and what the organizational issues are around there, but would sort of welcome that conversation too, because it all feels like solvable problems. Like some of our problems you look and you think like, what do you do? But with the library, it's like, well, this is fixable, right? Like there's a way to get around this.
It's also not a political issue. Do you find, I mean, are some councils running libraries more effectively? I'm sure someone is going to bring Cape Town into the conversation, or they'll bring themselves in. But do we find that, in different parts of the country, there are different levels of service?
I can't pretend to be an expert on all the cities in South Africa, but I think that is the case when you speak with the librarians, that depending on which area you're in, you have a different level of service. I do think in Joburg, it's... the librarians are amazing, and if you look at what they're doing in the digital space, there's a lot of really cool activities happening. You can download free ebooks and free audiobooks from the Joburg City Library, even now. They run a lot of online training programs, and you can do those online programs in person at the library to learn how to use Oracle or Microsoft skills or Google skills to do the behind-the-scenes work, the real IT work. And I think if they would talk about that more, it also takes some of the edge off around the services we don't have, because you can see, oh, well, this is what you're doing with the situation that you have, but then let's celebrate that and get more people trained to do Oracle at the library. Like, what a great outcome would that be?
I can think of, if you think of the New York State Library, the main library in the center of New York, and I've been lucky enough to go in there once, I can think of 2 Hollywood blockbusters that have used that as a setting for something, right? One was better than the other, and one was probably the best Spider-Man movie ever produced. And they're in those movies. The people making those movies have specifically chosen them because it's such a well-known place. So many people who've seen those movies have been in that building. I mean, Joburg Central Library could be exactly the same.
Absolutely, and it is iconic in that way. And when if you've been inside, it's a very beautiful space. It's a very interesting space. And I think the New York model is interesting because the park outside of the New York Public Library is Bryant Park, which is actually managed in a public-private partnership through a nonprofit. So a nonprofit was set up in the 80s. It was a no-go zone. You didn't go into the park. But they created a nonprofit. The city is part of it. But you have corporates, members of the public, community members, and they manage that together and then make it a much more interesting space. So suddenly you have an outdoor library under a tent. You've got games. You can play horseshoes and ping pong, and they do ice skating in the winter, which I'm not saying ice skating is our solution to like downtown Joburg. But you can imagine a situation where you do have theater, music, soccer, There's ways to program that outside space, but it needs to be done in a collaborative way. And I think there's so much goodwill towards the space to really have an open-minded conversation about what's a different way to organize it than what we've been doing.
The library's not just about books, it's a community.
It's a community, and it's a space where we don't have enough spaces where people feel safe, where they can go and spend time, know that nothing horrible is going to happen here, and where there is some level of programming. Because the library also used to do small business development classes, like how do you grow your small business? How do you, learn a new skill? The book club, the last time I went to the book club there, which was years ago now, but you had EFF members in red berets, you had grannies like in jerseys, you had business people coming in from the banks in their suits, you had kids, and they had all actually read the book, which like my book club, it's a little bit hit and miss sometimes,
More about the wine. Griffin Shea, thank you very much indeed. Really do appreciate it.